Okay, we agree. So good afternoon and welcome everyone, both here in the room and online. We are now ready for this second inaugural lecture of our memory center called the LIMS, the Interdepartmental Laboratory Memory and Society, which was founded in 2022 and is co-managed by the Department of Humanities and the Department of Sociology of the University of Trento. We thought it would be good to have two inaugural lectures over this year so that we could best express the different thematic, methodological, and disciplinary souls of our memory center. Our choice fell on two leading scholars, Aleida Assmann first. She was here last March speaking about the transformations of the European dream for her theorization about cultural memory, and Karl-Joachim Hölkeskamp for his mastery in combining memory studies and ancient history. Professor Hölkeskamp from the University of Cologne is one of the most internationally renowned Roman historian and also memory scholar. And due to this combination of expertise, his lecture will touch the very core of our memory center. Actually, it was Maurizio Giangiulio who first systematically introduced the study of social memory and the anthropology of oral tradition in the Italian tradition of research in ancient history, and established a new way of investigating ancient Greek history, which Elena Franchi and myself are trying to pursue in our turn here in Trento. So in this framework, Karl-Joachim Hölkeskamp's work, without any doubt, plays an inspirational, not to say foundational role. So it is not only a formal courtesy if I say that it is an honor for us to have him in Trento. I thank him so much for accepting our invitation. And I'll now give the floor to Maurizio Giangiulio, who will introduce our guest speaker.
Thank you very much. Okay, I think that a particularly warm welcome is needed, especially in this room. I don't think I will be able to make warmer this room. In any case, my welcome to Hölkeskamp and Karl-Joachim Hölkeskamp is very, very warm. Just a few words. Karl-Joachim Hölkeskamp is an ancient historian of the highest international standard, ranging from Homer to Greek tyrants and legislators, from the world of the polis to Roman aristocracies and the Republican political regime and political culture. But above all, he is one of the thinking heads of the historical study of the ancient world. In particular, he is one of those historians who regard interpretive categories and models, conceptual frameworks, and more generally abstract notions as an integral part of every historian's toolbox. In other words, all of Hölkeskamp's research is inspired, I think, by the awareness that history must be in close dialogue with the social sciences. In his case, especially political anthropology, sociology, political theory, law, and theories of memory. This is why inviting him to deliver this inaugural lecture seemed to Giorgio Proietti and me a very appropriate way to launch the second year of activity of our interdepartmental laboratory on memory and society. So we are particularly grateful that he has accepted our invitation, and we warmly welcome him to Trento. And we also welcome Hölkeskamp, who tomorrow, together with her husband, will hold a methodological seminar entitled Researching Ancient History. And now I give again the floor to Giorgio Proietti, who will give us some details of our host's scientific interests and publications. Thank you.
Yes, very quickly, but before giving the floor to our guest speaker, I'd like to add a quick something to what Maurizio Giangiulio has just said. What I would like to underline once more is that Professor Hölkeskamp's master in the field concerns not only his specific research results, mainly regarding the political, social, and cultural history of the Roman Republic, as this selection of books, I guess, vaguely suggests, but even more the sophisticatedness of the theoretical and methodological outillage that he consistently uses in the historical analysis and interpretation of the ancient evidence. And to this regard, I would like to mention one essay by Professor Hölkeskamp, one among hundreds, which stands out in its general methodological value for the study of ancient history. I'm speaking of this one, In Defense of Concepts, Categories, and Other Abstractions, Remarks on a Theory of Memory in the Making, which appeared in a 2014 book edited by Karl Galinsky, Memoria Romana, Memory in Rome, and Rome in Memory. And I would also like to share a quote from this study. Partly paraphrasing Reinhard Koselleck in his seminal book Futures Past on the Semantics of Historical Time, 1979, to which the title itself of his lecture is inspired, Professor Hölkeskamp says that any relic that we turn into a source and thus into evidence by our questions refers us to a history that is something more or less, but at any rate something other than the relic itself. It is these questions that lead us beyond or beneath the surface of individual acts, facts, and dates to the underlying contexts and interdependencies, structures, long-range developments and processes, and two ways of thinking, judging, and distinguishing between right and wrong, to the repertoire of values, binding rules, and prevalent norms of past or historical societies. And last but not least, to the ways and means, media, and strategies, explicit or implicit, of constructing and reproducing their collective identity in the shape of shared memory or memories. These questions call for reflection, not only on methods and models, concepts and categories, but also on what we want to do in classics and history, ancient as well as modern, and the humanities in general. That means that we are in need of a theory or even a repertoire of theories in a broad sense of the concept. I think this quote perfectly synthesizes Hölkeskamp's own work and also what we do in Trento, and ultimately also what the LIMS itself is about. Last but not least, about such problems and perspectives of research in ancient history, Professor Hölkeskamp will speak together with Professor Hölkeskamp tomorrow in a seminar which is thought specifically for advanced graduate students and PhD students at 10 a.m. upstairs in Targetti room. Professor Hölkeskamp is an ancient historian herself, author of important books. You can see some of them here, such as her famous Cultural History of Greek Aristocracy, Adelskultur und Polisgesellschaft, 1989, and others. And together with Karl-Joachim Hölkeskamp, she has co-authored and co-edited several important books dealing with both Greek and Roman history. I would like to mention some of them, in particular, the two wonderful volumes of die Erinnerungsorte der Antike, die Römische Welt und die Griechische Welt. And I would also like to mention that in 2017, the couple was awarded the Karl Christ Prize with the book Ethos, Ehre, Exzellenz, Antike Eliten im Vergleich. So I'd like to thank Professor Hölkeskamp too very, very much for accepting our invitation and for contributing to these 2 days, which are so important for us and for our colleagues and students. I'll shut up now, and with great pleasure, I'll give the floor to Professor Hölkeskamp, who will guide us through the history, memories, and monu-menta of the Roman Republic.
I'm a bit ashamed about these introductions.
Well deserved.
Well deserved. Well, I don't know. Thanks very much, and mille grazie, Giorgia e a Maurizio, for the invitation. And well, for the very kind and very detailed introduction. Signore e signori, prima di tutto vorrei scusarmi per aver fatto la mia presentazione in inglese. Non voglio disturbarvi con il mio pessimo italiano. Futures past. Well, the other way around would work as well. Future pasts, because there is never only one past. Anyway, for Reinhard Koselleck, concepts not only have their history or different histories, or her stories. Also, the other way around, history, historical consciousness, historical thinking, and historical imagination of a society can crystallize in concepts, especially when it comes to their interpretation and reinterpretation in semantic battles over competing narratives. In such struggles, the interpretive sovereignty over the history of a given society, its traditions, its political social order, its validity and legitimacy is always at stake. And it is above all about the validity of the prevailing interpretations and their multimedia representation, not only in concepts and canonical texts, but also in texts of other kinds, that is, in images, in architecture, monuments and memorials, in marked sites and intentionally designed showplaces, in rituals, festivals, and commemorative days. More precisely formulated, the struggle for the right terms gains social and political explosiveness, according to Koselleck, because it is a matter of defining political and social positions and maintaining them by virtue of these definitions, or asserting these positions in the first place. And this is especially true in times of crises and unrest, such as in the civil wars of the second half of the 1st century BCE, when such positions, as well as their definitions, became highly controversial. This brings us to the topic and the concrete concepts that directly and indirectly, explicitly and implicitly, were up for such new definitions and interpretations after the sheer question of power had been decided in favor of the last remaining warlord on the battlefields of the decades before 30 BCE. At this point of time, this warlord wielded sole and sweeping power over an empire that stretched from southern Spain to the Black Sea and from the mouth of the Rhine to Egypt, a power which could no longer be challenged by anything or anyone. He had not yet mutated into the Prince of Peace as Augustus. He still called himself Imperator Kaiser Divi Filius. That name in itself was a problem, just because it already implicitly refers to one of the central concepts mentioned. His adoptive father, the deified Gaius Julius Caesar, his predecessor as imperator and conqueror of the world and of unlimited power over Rome and the empire, and as dictator for life, had been murdered for the sake of freedom, as the leaders of the widespread conspiracy had claimed. This freedom, libertas, traditionally had two dimensions. On the one hand, it meant freedom from autocracy, the tyranny hated as regnum, which was traditionally understood as the high-handed, violent, and arbitrary rule of one individual over the populus Romanus and its governing body, the Senate. First, thank you. Soon after the end of the civil wars, the later Augustus demonstratively claimed to have restored this freedom. As this coin from 28 BCE testifies, the Imperator Caesar allowed himself to be celebrated as liberator, or more precisely, as vindex libertatis, that is, as guarantor and warrantor of freedom. With this designation, his propagandists reverted to a traditional procedural terminology that belonged in the traditional republican context of the judicial determination of a person's status as free or slave. Even in his Res Gestae, his report of deeds, written only shortly before his death in 14 Christian era, he claimed to have, quote, regained freedom for the res publica, oppressed by the tyranny of a clique. On the other hand, libertas meant the freedom to engage in the regular annual fierce competition for those coveted positions which, as honores, conferred official power, potestas, and command over the armies of the Republic, imperium. These positions, especially the consulship, ensured lasting influence and prestige, auctoritas and dignitas, for their holders even beyond their year of office. For centuries, these honores had been the actual basis of individual membership of the senatorial aristocracy, as well as of rank within this political social elite. And it was, above all, proving one's worth in these political military leadership positions through personal qualities such as virtus and exemplary heroic deeds, which had formed the backbone of the traditional narrative of Rome's rise to imperial greatness. The other term, at least as sensitive, was res publica. According to Cicero's classical definition, the common cause of the people, based on order, law, and justice, summed up in the short formula Senatus Populusque Romanus. The dictator Caesar had allegedly stated in public that the res publica was nothing, a mere name without body or form. After 20 years of civil wars with typical changes of sides, intrigues and betrayals, human losses in countless battles in Italy, Greece, the Middle East and Egypt, in North Africa and Spain, this cynical dictum had become bitter truth. And now the victor found himself confronted with the pressing question of what the res publica still was, what it should henceforth become, and above all, who could legitimately lay claim to standing for it and representing it. In secure position of power, the young Caesar, to become Augustus, took up the semantic battle for the interpretation of these two central concepts, and he had to win it. He was to emerge victorious from this struggle in the end, according to Paul Zanker's classical set phrase, not least thanks to the power of images through which Augustus was able to impose his interpretation of the present and above all of the history of the Populus Romanus, its res publica and its empire. An empire whose boundaries he himself had pushed forward to the edges of the known world. This struggle was the central dimension of the complex strategies of his self-contraction and self-representation as princeps. Strategies which were designed to veil as well as legitimize the perpetuation of his unrivaled position. Its complexity resulted not only from the constant effort formally and institutionally to secure his de facto absolute power as autocrat by an accumulation of individual special powers. This was a year-long process that did not end with the acts of state in 28 and 27 BCE, to which I will return in a moment. At first, he filled one of the two consulships year after year. In the regular consulships, his formal potestas was limited by the renewed validity of the revered republican principles of annuity and collegiality. And after 27, he said again, I surpassed all in influence, auctoritas, but in official power, potestas, I possessed no more than those who were my colleagues in the respective offices. This assertion is a half-truth, cleverly concealing the aforementioned accumulation of special powers. In any case, it was only consistent that he demonstratively resigned his 11th regular consulship in the summer of 23 in order not to monopolize the position in the collegium of the regular highest magistrates permanently. Indeed, after that, descendants of distinguished families of the old republican aristocracy of office now regularly appeared again in the lists of the highest magistrates, well, of those families who had survived the civil wars. Augustus's special informal authority came naturally to him as a consequence, as a kind of bonus in recognition of his outstanding merits and achievements for the res publica. This was entirely in keeping with the traditional meritocratic ethos of the aristocracy. Moreover, this was also in keeping with the fact that the young Caesar had already been appointed princeps senatus in the year 28. This was the traditional title of the highest ranking senator, according to the century-old custom always conferred on a particular respected former consul from the old patriciate, who was placed at the top of the list by the censors, in the revision of the senatorial register held every 5 years. The princeps senatus had the privilege of expressing his opinion in the debates of the High House as first speaker. At the same time, however, the term in the plural principes traditionally referred to the entire group of former consuls who, as the first men of the Senate, enjoyed outstanding auctoritas and the highest reputation, dignitas. However, the general auctoritas was not everything. It was above all a special imperium, limited in time in an apparently sound republican way, but repeatedly renewed and de facto superior, which secured for the princeps the supreme command over the legions in the provinces on the borders of the empire. This imperium and its regular renewals characteristically do not appear in his titulature or in his res gestae. In addition, there was the power of a tribune of the plebs, tribunicia potestas, also annually renewed, through which he received important initiative rights in the city and certain individual special assignments like the cura annone. Demonstratively and publicly, however, Augustus rejected all titles and functions which, as he repeatedly emphasized, were offered to him by Senate and people: dictatorship and annual consulship for life, sole commissioner for legislation and moral order with supreme official power, summa potestate. For, he emphasized, such powers violated the custom of the ancestors, contra morem maiorum, namely the iron principles of limit of tenure and collegiality. We will soon see who these ancestors were. Above all, this comprehensive array of actual powers was never allowed to become visible. It was precisely this invisibilization, terrible word, of his power that was the essential prerequisite for the long-term success of the permanent and equally arduous endeavors to retain approbation of his person as princeps. Above all, this was absolutely important in order to safeguard lasting acceptance of the new order on the part of the senatorial aristocracy, the populus Romanus in Rome, and Italy, as well as the elites in the provinces. On the one hand, this was achieved by his self-construction as first citizen and civilis princeps. On the other, the long-term stabilization and even increase of his power resulted from a complex combination of the strategies of carefully staged legitimizing visibility and, at the same time, of equally careful concealing of power. It was precisely in this way that Augustus set himself apart from his deified adoptive father and his increasingly distanced and overbearing lordly habitus as an all-powerful dictator, which had, after all, brought Caesar père under suspicion of being a tyrant, striving for the traditionally hated kingship. The core of the aforementioned strategies consisted of a multimedia staged reference back to the very traditional res publica that Caesar père had declared dead. Caesar fils staged its salvation and revival as restitutio rei publicae, first in an edict by which all orders from the time of the civil wars, including his own, were repealed as unlawful on the last day of his sixth consulship, that is 31st of December 28, once again. Yes, the next one, thank you. It was just in this year that a coin with telling symbolism was minted. On the obverse, we see the portrait of Imperator Caesar Divi Filius, consul for the sixth time, who on the reverse is demonstrative represented not in his war attire, but in the civil toga, sitting on the official chair of a consul and handing over scrolls. With this symbolic act, according to the transcription, he restored laws and rights of the Roman people, leges et jura PR restituit. The abbreviation can be read, possibly intentionally, as genitive populi Romani or as dative populo Romano. According to the first reading, he would only have restored the traditional rights and laws that the Roman people had always possessed. According to the second reading, he would have accorded the people rights and laws by virtue of his personal authority. Be that as it may, this is precisely what was to happen soon afterwards in an act of state in January 27. He returned, according to the significant formulations in his res gestae, the powers previously conferred on him by consensus universorum, from his power, potestas, to the free discretion of Senate and people. He then enumerates the honors that were subsequently offered to him by this Senate and people, among them a golden shield erected in the Senate Hall, celebrating his bravery, clemency, justice, and devotion to duty, virtus clementia, justitia, and pietas. All came from the traditional vocabulary of the value system of the Republican senatorial aristocracy. And finally, he was also granted the honorific title Augustus. The usual translation of the exalted one tends to obscure the very concrete religious sacral connotations. The title has the same root not only as auctoritas, but also as the ancient priestly college of augurs founded by Romulus or the second king Numa Pompilius. And moreover, alludes to the Augurium Augustum, that founding act of augury by Romulus, which, according to a long-established myth, had marked the beginning of the city's history. In fact, some senators had previously even considered giving him the name of the city's founder and patron hero as an honorary name. But there were very good reasons for refraining from doing so. On the one hand, the name of the first king was associated with undesirable monarchical associations. The young Caesar did not want to appear as a monarch. On the other hand, a version of the death of Romulus had come into circulation by this time, according to which the senators had eliminated the founder king who had degenerated into a tyrant by literally tearing him apart. The parallel to the murder of the dictator Caesar by senators was all too obvious. These formal acts, however, were only one side and the beginning of the strategy of restitutio. This also included the administration and multiplication of the imperial heritage of the Res Publica, the honoring and renewal of its political and above all religious institutions, of time-honored cults, solemn sacrifices and consecrations, of rules and rituals, of festivals, games, and time and again of spectacular processions. The great impresario Augustus not only made use of this rich repertoire, which had been developed and refined over centuries. He also expanded it with new dramas, such as the elaborately staged secular games of 17 BCE, which marked the ultimate end of the bad old days and the beginning of a new golden age. However, even this spectacular festival was also significantly designated as a revival of a time-honored, that is, Republican tradition. It was precisely this repertoire that inevitably meant that the new Augustus, as holder of superior auctoritas, ultimately had to submit to a culture-specific Roman force, indeed, to the power of memory, or the tyranny of tradition. This was the consequence and the price to pay for his orientation towards a tradition that knew no ruler. This means, although the princeps in fact exercised an unrepublican, indeed monarchical, accumulation of powers, he deliberately, demonstratively, and consistently acted as a republican by assuming and playing the part of the first servant of the Res Publica on a grand stage. A part that was embedded in the aforementioned tradition of republican principes leading the state. This part was a completely new role, but it was not to be recognized as new, and above all as unprecedented, that is, unrepublican. It was precisely this dilemma that made it one of the most difficult roles ever played in the world history of politics. In other words, by consistently committing himself to this self-constructed role as princeps, Augustus had to submit to the patterns of public behavior and established forms of communication at eye level necessarily associated with it. In the final analysis, he had to be what he appeared to be. The extent to which Augustus was aware of this was allegedly summed up by himself before he passed away on 19th of August, 14 Christian era. Exiting from the stage of the world he had entered as a 19-year-old and eventually dominated for almost half a century. On his deathbed, he is said to have asked those around him if he had played the mimus, comedy or even farce, of life in a pleasing manner, asking for applause with the traditional farewell formula of actors to the theater of audience in Greek. But if we have played well, applaud and all give us your leave with joy. Whatever variant of a mimus the dying princeps may have had in mind, he was certainly well aware of the theatrical dimensions and constraints of his complex role on the political stage, his strategies of self-construction and self-legitimization as first citizen and princeps civilis, and not least of locating himself in a newly canonized narrative of glorious history with himself as telos and ultimate goal. This history, or rather his story, its contents and ideological messages will now finally be the focus of our attention. In particular, the multimedia strategies of conveying them, which are at the same time themselves part of the message. I'm going to explain that. It is the narrative of the rise of the people in the toga, the gens togata to lords of the world, who, according to the will of, to the will of Jupiter, were to rule over an empire without borders, imperium sine fine, in time and space, as Virgil put it in the Roman national epic, the Aeneid. This narrative was condensed into canonical history and consisted of a complex fabric of myths, legends, and exemplary stories, which formed the subject matter of a specific memorial culture. This narrative of a glorious history revolved around a basic message, as simple as it was comprehensive. The imperial greatness of the Republic, resulting from a long series of wars and glorious victories on the battlefields. It was a narrative that was present everywhere and could be invoked at any time. It was at once permanently monumentalized in public spaces and regularly performatively called up, updated, and perpetuated through monuments and temples financed by war booty on the one hand. That was a nice slip, war beauty, but I mean war booty, sorry. And through rituals such as triumphs and other processions on the other. The ideological consensus on values, orientations, views of the world and their validity, which was supposed to unite elite and people, actors and addressees, was also ceremonially and staged by multimedia means. And the lasting success of this particular kind of drama suggests that this consensus was certainly more than a mere facade or fiction. And this message was irresistible. On the one hand, the spaces of the political sacred topography were marked and reserved as the stages of these magnificent spectacles. On the other hand, the rituals staged there only became meaningful on the monumental stages designed for them, which thereby gained their full social, political, ideological, and cultural meaning. At the same time, a claim of the political class that was as comprehensive as it was exclusive and downright imperious was inscribed in this ensemble from the outset. Its present greatness was owed solely to the superiority of its leadership, grown over generations and gloriously confirmed by success. It was the achievements of a long line of representatives of this class in politics and above all in war, achievements that were claimed as the collective accomplishment and merit of the aristocracy. And it was in turn this claim that legitimized all the hierarchies and the entitlement to and demand for authority and influence, rank, prestige, and prominence of the individual members of the senatorial aristocracy, their families, and the elite as a whole. And this legitimation was and remained all the more effective and stable because it, in turn, was inscribed as a firm foundation in the aforementioned consensus between elite and people. This narrative could be continued and partially rewritten, but Augustus did not want to, and indeed could not, supersede it by overwriting it without residue. And since he could not and would not withdraw from the power of this tradition, he presented himself as its preserver and final perfecter. This necessarily meant that the princeps had to adopt and appropriate not only the central concepts of the traditional aristocratic ethos and the ideological messages which were inscribed in the aforementioned republican tradition. Precisely because of these contents, also and above all, was he obliged to use only the traditional repertoire of performative strategies and monumental imagery to convey them. Augustus had at his disposal the entire rich repertoire of visual media, representative monuments, and architectural forms that had been unfolding since the Middle Republic. He was able to exploit this repertoire consistently, but only had to expand it cautiously, to a certain extent selectively and quantitatively. Thus, also in this respect, he used the powerful force of the traditions of a republic whose restoration to its old and new greatness as an omnipresent ideological message constituted the basis and legitimation of his role as princeps. In this respect, however, a second famous saying of the princeps must be put into perspective. The city of bricks that Augustus said to have found only to leave it as a city of marble had already begun to change its face, with the temples, basilicas, porticos, and representative monuments, such as works of art of all kinds, statues, images, and dedications of telling booty erected in the centuries before. It was an exceedingly rich heritage that the Republic had left to the princeps. Under his regime, the continuation of this traditional munificentia publica was characterized by a new quality of unification, harmonization, and monumentality, but not more than that. Parallel to the differentiation of the aforementioned repertoire, a dense interrelation of the individual concrete visual media, their languages, images, and texts had already emerged. That means that the various genres of public buildings and monuments formed a densely interconnected ensemble of texts. At the same time, these texts themselves constituted ensembles each with its own syntax and vocabulary, logics and messages of a culture-specific monu-mentality, as Tonio Hölscher has put it. It was the very interdependence of these texts that exponentiated the force of the ideological message of the historical moral mission of the gens togata as masters of the world under the leadership of an uniquely successful political military elite. The monumental witnesses of a great past, which kept the origins and stages of the rise to world power on the Roman Forum, Comitium, and Capitol present, had been donated for the most part by the very Republican heroes whose statues now stood in the imposing Hall of Honor of the new monumental forum that bore Augustus's name. I will come back to that in a moment. It was about the memory of those great figures of the long history of the city who had led the imperium, power and rule of the Roman people from the smallest beginnings to present greatness. And Augustus explicitly placed himself in this line by declaring in an edict that both he himself, as long as he lived, and the principes who would succeed him could and should be measured by the citizens by their example. This term, exemplum, in the sense of example as model and exemplar, denotes a central dimension of the idea of the rise of the gens togata and its imperium sine fine, to take up once again the already mentioned, often quoted phrase of the Aeneid. The term encapsulates the core of a canonical history. It was the exemplary deeds of the great figures of the past, who, by these deeds in politics and especially in war, had demonstrated their virtus and the other traditional qualities, such as personal bravery and the abilities to lead. These qualities included steadfastness, fortitudo and constantia, and practical wisdom, sapientia, which were celebrated, for example, in the speeches at a pompa funebris, the elaborate funeral ritual of the great families of the Republican aristocracy of office, and in the inscriptions on their funerary monuments. Among them were also those of the Clypeus virtutis, such as, above all, Justitia and Pietas, in the sense of faithful devotion to duty to the gods and to the fatherland. The cultivation of this memory was, in turn, a central part of a specific policy which represented the ideological core of the entire legitimation strategy of the Restitutio Republicae. This included, on the one hand, the restoration and preservation of old monuments and buildings, while retaining the previous dedicatory inscriptions, so Suetonius in his Life of Augustus, that is, without any mention of his own name, and thus retaining the names of the original donors as he himself claimed in the Res Gestae. Next, please. A telling example is the monument in honor of a certain Gaius Duilius, a homo novus, who made it to the consulship in 260 BCE and had won the first significant naval victory over a large Carthaginian fleet as admiral of the newly built Roman fleet. Among other special honors, he received a statue on a several feet high column erected in a prominent position, namely in the ancient center of political and religious life, the Forum Romanum. It was also directly positioned on the route of the triumphal processions. The columna rostrata was decorated with telling pieces of booty, namely the ship's beaks, the rostra of captured ships. At the base of the column was a monumental inscription measuring about 3 by 4 feet, meticulously recording the victory and the special achievements which the honorand had been the very first person to accomplish in the whole history of the city. This text enumerated the number of captured and sunk ships, the spectacular triumphus navalis, the nature and exact quantity of the booty, and its being given to the people. Significantly, however, this inscription, like possibly the whole monument, was indeed renovated or possibly entirely reconstructed, including the inscription, which, though modernized, was deliberately recreating the ancient republican epigraphic habit. Interestingly, this recreation probably dates to the Augustan period. The young Caesar and later Augustus had himself received a columnar rostrata bearing his statue. Next, please. This honor had been granted to him by popular decision after the warlord Sextus Pompeius, operating from Sicily, had been decisively defeated in the naval battle at Naulochos in 36 BCE. The position of this honorific monument, mentioned only in literary tradition and attested by this coin, is not known. However, it is not improbable that it was erected in the Forum Romanum within sight of the Duilius column, which it sort of quoted. Interesting enough, the Imperator Caesar is naked on that column. He is not going to perpetuate that Greek custom. A few years later, on 2nd of September 31 BCE, there was again a decision at sea. The fleets of Cleopatra and Antony were crushed. The young Caesar was thus the sole victor and set about the aforementioned consolidation of his omnipotent position in the form of the Restitutio Rei Publicae. In addition to the strategies already mentioned, this also included the renovation of no less than 82 temples, sorry, of 82 temples, which he, ex auctoritate senatus, as he himself time and again emphasized, claimed to have accomplished in precisely that 6th consulship in the year 28, in which the restitutio policy began to gain momentum. Among these temples was also the temple of the two-faced god Janus, founded by Duilius from funds captured in his campaign, ex manubiis, and mentioned in the aforementioned inscription. After Actium, the consul, admiral, and triumphator Duilius had finally become a predecessor of the princeps, and his exemplary achievements had set a benchmark against which the later Augustus could be measured. At last, he had by then far surpassed his predecessor. Of course, Duilius was also one of the great figures of history who received a statue in the Hall of Honor of the Augustan Forum. This spectacular site, which bore the name of the princeps, thus represented the culmination and at the same time the quintessence, in the full sense of the concept, of Augustus's myth-historically based ideology and multimedia self-construction as princeps. Next, please. It was dominated in the full sense by the temple of Mars Ultor, to this divine avenger. The young Caesar had already vowed a shrine during his campaign against the murderers of his adoptive father. The temple was lavishly furnished, not only with regard to the architecture, the materials used, and the architectural decoration, but above all, with regard to the cult images and the figures on the pediment. Venus was considered the progenitor of the gens Julia, and thus of Divus Julius and his adopted son. The god of war Mars was, according to a variant myth, the father of the city's founder Romulus. The mythical references were taken up again in the two northern apses. Aeneas as the son of Venus, surrounded by her Julian descendants, and the kings of the predecessor city of Alba Longa again faced Romulus, and the latter was surrounded by Summi Viri as the imperatores, triumphators, and republican principes were called in a later source. The selection and presentation of the mythical figures, and above all of the historical imperatores and republican magistrates, was the actual reason for the edict already mentioned, through which Augustus virtually claimed to compete with them, their achievements and their virtus. The series of these statues, impressive through sheer numbers, virtually populated the two deep porticos, that is, elongated columned halls, which flank this monumental place. The marble statues were probably slightly larger than life and stood in niches between the columns. They were depicted partly in the attire of commanding generals or in the regalia of a triumphator, partly as togati in the civilian robes of office as magistrates. Each statue sported two inscriptions. The brief titulus under the statue contained only the name with affiliation and the enumeration of the offices of the figure represented, apparently from the highest office in descending order. Like the titulus under the statue of that famous general in the war against Hannibal, who went down in collective memory as Cunctator. Quintus Fabius, son of Quintus Maximus, twice dictator, 5 times consul, censor, twice interrix, curule aedile, twice quaestor, twice military tribune, pontifex augur. By contrast, the detailed elogium on the pedestal of the statue offered not only the concrete deeds, achievements, and successes in politics, and especially in war, but also mentioned, for example, endowments of temples from booty money, as the elogium of Duilius. Finally, there were the special honors, such as triumphs or the erection of a monument of honor, as again in the elogium of Duilius, which in terms of content and the archaizing linguistic style looks like a deliberate quotation from the restored inscription on the base of the columnar strata. The aforementioned restoration of the Duilius column, including inscription, was obviously by no means an isolated case. On the venerable Forum Romanum, we know of fragments of elogia from Augustan times that refer to no less than 15 other personalities of Republican history. Among them, other particularly prominent figures who, like Duilius, were firmly anchored in cultural memory and whose statues then also reappear in the impressive gallery of Summi Viri on Augustus's forum. Thus, the elogium for the legendary Furius Camillus may have belonged to the ancient, or at least seemingly ancient, statue on the speaker's platform. The older and the younger Pliny at least still had precise knowledge of this statue. Namely, according to ancient custom, he was depicted only in the toga, but without the undergarment of the tunica, like the statues of Romulus and the kings on the Capitol, which were also considered ancient. Camillus, this Dux Fatalis, conqueror of neighboring Veii, victor over the Gallic invaders, and thus savior of the city, was regarded as its second founder after Romulus, and moreover, according to the Augustan historian Livy, as first princeps in peace as in war, and not least father of the fatherland, pater patriae. I will return to that symbolic significance of this tradition soon. Tituli and elogia were a deliberate recourse to a traditional medium of self-representation of the great families of the Republican aristocracy, who had over centuries developed a specific epigraphic culture. The scant tituli were probably the older form. They identified, in a sense, the wax masks of deceased ancestors, which were kept in closed cabinets on the walls of the atria in the residences of the great families, each cabinet bearing a titulus on the outside. These imagines were presented on two ceremonial occasions. On the one hand, when the head of the household had been elected consul, he decorated the images of his ancestors with laurel. On the other hand, when he himself was borne to his grave in the elaborate ritual of a pompa funebris, the imagines of his ancestors were carried by persons who also wore the official garb of the highest office attained during their lives, or the magnificent purple regalia of a triumphator. The ancestors symbolically present in this way included, however, only those who had an imago, because they had attained a certain rank in the hierarchy of offices. Their masks formed a splendid procession with the imago of the eldest ancestor at the head, thus representing the historical importance and rank of the family, rooted in a more or less distant past. The procession stopped at the political center of the city. The ancestors took their seats of official, on official chairs of the higher magistrates, and the son of the deceased delivered the eulogy from the speaker's platform at the Comitium. And such a laudatio funebris not only celebrated the rank, achievements, and honors of the deceased, but then turned to each of his symbolically present ancestors. In this way, the recently deceased was, as it were, received into the circle of his ancestors. He was then buried in the representative burial place of his family outside the city, for example, on the Via Appia. He then in turn received an imago with titulus in the family residence and possibly an elogium in the burial place, for which the laudatio had, as it were, provided the blueprint in terms of style and content. The best known and earliest surviving examples are the elogia on the sarcophagi in the tomb of the famous family of the Cornelius Scipiones, thank you, which date to the 3rd century BCE. The titulus in the upper part was actually applied in red paint. The elogium was executed as an inscription. The choreography of the time-honored Republican ritual of the pompa funebris was also to serve as a model for Augustus, who had planned his own spectacular funeral down to the last detail. On this occasion, the deliberate modifications of the traditional ritual of aristocratic self-presentation played a significant role. First, Augustus himself was represented by no less than 3 different statues, one of which was made of wax and dressed in the triumphal regalia. The second gilded statue was carried out of the curia, the Senate hall, and the third stood on a triumphal chariot. In addition, tituli were carried before the Lettere, on which the laws enacted by Augustus were listed on the one hand, and, just like at the triumph, the names of the nations he had defeated were enumerated on the other. Not one, but 2 laudationes were held in the forum. The younger Drusus, spoke from the rostra, and the new princeps Tiberius from the opposite platform of the temple of Divus Iulius. Above all, the line of ancestor did not precede the deceased, but followed him, and this line was extended to include all the great men of the city's glorious history since Romulus. This pompa obviously reflected the statue program on the Forum Augustum, which now also gave performative expression to the same universal imperial claim of the first princeps to be both heir and ultimate perfecter of the historical mission of the gens Togata. The same ancestors of the double kind, Julii and Sumiviri, made the parade a demonstration with a double message by its sheer length in space, which made its rootedness in the depths of time impressively visible. On the one hand, this did not radically deny the traditional syntax of the aristocratic Pompai. This served the symbolic self-localization of the symbolic self-localization of the princeps in the continuum of glorious history. On the other hand, everything that had gone before was not only eclipsed in terms of sheer quantity, but the semantics and symbolism of the procession were also qualitatively changed by the new, this time performative ceremonial appropriation of the Sumiviri from all the great republican gentes. As their descendant, successor, and heir, the princeps represented the final consummation of their common mission. But back to the great cunctator and his statue in the Hall of Honor. His elogium is also telling in another respect, which is particularly interesting in this context. Not only his victory and triumph over the Ligurian tribe in the first consulship, his successful warfare against Hannibal in the third and fourth consulships, and his conquest of Taranto, rewarded with a second triumph, were of course mentioned. In addition, his reputation as a cautious and prudent military leader was emphasized, as well as his being twice appointed princeps senatus. Above all, a peculiar episode took up conspicuously large amount of space. After he had rescued an army from a difficult situation, the cunctator had been called pater for this feat. After the aforementioned parens patriae and princeps Camillus, the most important general of the Hannibal War, who was later celebrated as the shield of Rome, and who, in the words of the poet Ennius, had saved the Roman cause by his wise hesitation, was thus, as it were, doubly marked out as a precursor and forerunner of Augustus as princeps and pater patriae. The princeps was thus located in a history of Rome and her empire that was conceptualized as a succession of principes with Augustus as the consummator. The monumental representation of this Augustan interpretation of history reached its climax and conclusion with the completion of the Forum Augustum. Thank you. The complex visualized narrative of the image and statue program of the Forum Augustum, with its myth-historical allusions and symbolic messages, now stood for the highest degree of condensation through cross-referencing. And moreover, this network of symbols and messages also included the aforementioned implicit allusions to the old statues on the Forum Romanum and the Capitol. Actually, however, it was only this degree of complexity that must be considered a real innovation in the repertoire of media of the self-construction of the princeps as savior of the Republic. For a successful restitutio rei publicae, that is, one that was also accepted by the elite and populus Romanus, and the concomitant self-construction of the princeps in the shape of his self-localization in the glorious history of the Republic as a credible legitimation strategy, made it imperative that he make use of the rich repertoire of traditional media inherited from the Republic to convey a convincing conception of this narrative. It was a special commemorative day, 1st of August, on which Augustus celebrated the forum that bore his name on a grand scale in the year 2 before Christian era, namely through spectacular games and the staging of a naval battle. On this day, 28 years earlier, he had finally, in his words, extinguished the civil war. He had finally been offered the traditional title of Pater Patriae. Quote, unanimously by the Senate, the Ordo Equester, and the Populus Romanus, as he emphasizes at the end of the Res Gesta, again in a somewhat abbreviated way. After initial rejection, he only accepted, allegedly, a corresponding official Senate resolution moved by the highly respected Valerius Messala, a former consul from a famous Republican noble family. This title now adorned the quadriga with a statue of Augustus as triumphator, which was set up right in the center of the large square complex. Thus, he was surrounded by the principes of the past in the galleries of the Summi Viri, and at the same time stood in their midst and in the focus of the aforementioned narrative. This combined the diachronic dimension of the rows of statues into a synchronous overall show, which detached the Summi Viri from the context of their heterogeneous and conflictual individual family histories and merged them into a homogeneous and harmonic collective. This was the quintessence of the presence of a constructed past in a present that was now supposed to point beyond this present into a glorious future. Thank you for your attention and for your patience.
Thank you, Professor Hölkeskamp, for this rich, detailed, to use some euphemisms, lecture. It was wonderful to hear a concrete example of your own quote that I mentioned before. You showed us what it means to go beneath and beyond the surface and discover structures, processes of self-representation, of representation of power, strategies, commemorative strategies, expressions of identity, and so on. So thank you. I think we can open up the field for a discussion. First of all, by inviting Professor Hölkeskamp to come here. We can maybe please press that button as well. In the meantime, I invite everyone in the room and also in the online audience to ask their questions. For those of you who are online, please just raise your hands or type your question in the chat box. Maybe I can give the floor to Hölkeskamp first, and then we can collect some questions from the two audiences.
Yes, after many years of work on remembrance and memory culture in Republican times, I think it's quite sort of interesting experiment to extend it to the Augustan time. And our, at least our generation, picture of Augustine time is very much influenced by Paul Zanker, Augustus und die Macht der Bilder. There's an English translation of, I think, Italian as well.
Yeah, sure.
Zanker emphasizes that everything is sort of new and exciting, and it was very innovative, so on. So I think we tried to find a model which is a bit more historical and sees the long tradition. Tradition is a very important concept in this work. And I think it would be a good idea at the beginning of this discussion to tell a bit more about tradition, when it starts and the way in which it developed.
May I?
Yeah, sure.
First of all, I would like to mention that the reconstruction of the Forum Augustum was made by a very talented graduate student of mine. Tradition. There is another German archaeologist apart from Paul Zanker, namely Tonio Hölscher, who was a major inspiration by several articles which began to be published in the late 70s, in the late 1970s. And on this basis, I tried to develop things further, first in my doctoral dissertation, which was published in 1987, and then in further work. It all revolves around a certain span of time, which is clearly identifiable. It's a time at the end, in the last quarter of the 4th century BCE already. It presupposes a certain social political, a very Roman specific social political development, namely the rise of a new kind of aristocracy that was in need to develop its strategies of self-presentations for very specific reasons, namely the new patricio-plebeian aristocracy, which was an aristocracy which was not, as the patriciate, the old patriciate, based on inherited sacred and religious privilege, but an aristocracy that was based on office. And offices were elective. So that called for communicative strategies between the electorate on the one hand and the candidates for these offices on the other. That does not mean that this was a democracy, as certain people in Britain have claimed, namely Sir Fergus Miller. I challenged his views already in several papers published in the 90s, but he refused to enter on a discussion on that. I mean, in 2008, he actually told me once, he said, "Karl, you don't understand it." Anyway, nobody really believes that, this kind of thing. But even an oligarchic political social elite, like the senatorial elite, was dependent on acceptance, on legitimacy, because after all, they needed this kind of acceptance, but when they ran for office, and without gaining office, they wouldn't have access to the Senate, and on the higher offices depended their rank within the aristocracy. And all that was mirrored, for example, in the time-honored rules of that sort of determined the procedure in the Senate. Those people without who had been consuls, the principes, the first of the Senate, were those who actually set the agenda. They took the floor first after the princeps senatus, the former consul with the highest seniority took the floor, etc., etc. A young man of 30, 32, 35, who was just a former quaestor or something, never actually took the floor in the Senate. That was the natural order of things, as it were. But all this needed a language or languages for in a variety of ways. And from about 420 to 400, we actually see a kind of dynamic, even explosive development of different genres, statues. There is a surge of dedications of temples, which starts pretty precisely during the Second Samnite War. That makes it, it starts around 410 BCE. From then on until the mid-2nd century, more than 80 new temples to completely new divinities were founded. Interestingly enough, to divinities that represented certain central virtues of the new aristocratic moral code, as it were. For example, temple to Bellona, goddess of war. Even a temple to the tempests, because somebody who was not really a good admiral had just escaped by the skin of his teeth with his fleet after from stormy weather. So he dedicated a temple to the tempests as the goddesses of storm. What actually he was the one whose elogium we have seen. That was the Lucius Cornelius Scipio. And then we have the custom of wax images. We don't know when it really started, but it looks as if the combined custom of wax images on the one hand and of presenting them at certain ceremonial occasions on the other originated only when the decisive criterion for aristocratic status became office holding, etc., etc. Then the custom of presenting representative pieces of booty in the public space in Rome took new dimensions, new quality, beginning around the final phase of Rome's conquest of Italy, etc., etc., etc. And we can actually put down all the combined development of these strategies in the 50 years between 420 and 260. Sorry, 320.
Thank you.
Old age.
If you don't mind, there is Marion Meyer who has raised a hand. So, hello.
Guten Abend, buonasera. I think I should start admitting. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
I think I should start admitting that, of course, I'm also very influenced by Paul Zanca. I mean, I heard his courses for a year. He was my first boss and everything. But I want to ask something about, tradition. You made a very convincing case of all these Roman traditions, mos maiorum and virtutes and the ancestors and everything. And I wanted to ask, and this is really an open question, what would you think of the Greek impact in dealing with the past, in making the past work for yourself? And what I mean is that a long time, even before Augustus, the Greeks, when dealing with the Romans, came up, and especially the Athenians, they came up with the achievements of their ancestors. I mean, they sent the heads of the philosophical schools to Rome to make a bargain. They came up with Sulla when he was in Athens and trying to make to negotiate something with the argument that they were the descendants of the big men of the Persian fighters. And what I mean is that this exploitations of achievements that were not their own, whether this might have been also a model, whether this strategy of working with the past for the present and the future, whether this might have been an inspiration for Augustus to exploit achievements and to exploit a tradition that was not his own. I mean, the Republicans, when they praised their ancestors, it was really their family and their merits and the merits of their immediate family. But Augustus exploited all the traditions that were not his own and not that only of his family. So I wonder whether you see a Greek or possible impact of a Greek model of working with the past there.
As you say, it's an open question. But I mean, I remain pretty skeptical of that because there is not a single piece of evidence that that would actually point into that direction, that Augustus, as it were, intentionally used Greek traditions. On the other hand, having said that, there is a massive Greek influence on the development and differentiation of visual media, at least since the mid-2nd century, if not earlier. However, I remember a very interesting article by Andrew Wallace-Hadwell about Greek traditions and the Roman sort of appropriation of these traditions, even of Greek, of these marvelous Greek sort of visual languages. And he claims that the Romans were pretty adamant or pretty experienced in taking over representative forms of visualizing success, history, etc., but actually filled these forms that they took over with their own contents. And my whole point is, if Augustus was to be successful in his self-construction as restitutor rei publicae, he had to insist and he had to emphasize an exclusively Roman tradition and constructed according to sozusagen, as it were, explicit Roman narratives that had developed from about the end of the 3rd century in the form of senatorial historiography, like Fabius Pictor, etc., etc. I mean, we know nowadays, we have a discussion on Fabius Pictor, but we know nowadays, although he wrote in Greek, he wasn't really interested in the Greek world. It's a Greek way of negotiating Roman values, Roman history, Roman family traditions, etc. Even a senator writing in Greek was obviously not very influenced by the contents of Greek traditions, but only by the form. So I remain skeptical. Sorry.
Oh, thank you.
Yes, you are. Well, you are Zanka, and I'm a pupil of Karl-Joachim. You know that article in Römische Mitteilung 1978. That was what I referred to.
Posso stare seduto? I would like to add another dimension to this already extremely stimulating discussion. I mean, perhaps we should compare Augustus' approach to the past, by and large, to other historical situations. I mean, in Sparta, nothing was good, in a word, if it was not Lycurgan. And in mid-5th century Athens, very profound political innovations were presented as simply stripping the Areopagus, the supreme bulwark of the city, of some added, of some addictions in its power, and innovation was presented as simply return to the old time, the sacred old time. What I want to say is that perhaps one could figure out some sort of anthropological explanation of this kind of Arbeit am Traditionen, work with the past, in the sense that in some crucial historical situations, and the passage from Republic to Augustan regime was one of those, innovation needs to be understood as a reworking of tradition in order to be more strongly innovative, I think. What do you think about this comment?
I think that's very much, thank you very much, Maurizio. That is very much in tune with my approach. The culture specific sort of discourse over one's own, or the history of one's own group, citizen body, or whatever, or polis, or respublica, always included, in particular the discussion in Rome of the Mos Maiorum, always included the option of innovation, but the innovation had to be adapted to tradition, to things that were considered to be valid and should not be called into question. Within that framework, innovation could always be presented as a continuation, as a natural continuation of the past, of history, of Mos Maiorum, and at the same time, this was very much open to a narrative that actually claimed innovation to be the renovation of things that had been lost or had been marginalized. And that's exactly what Augustus did. That was part of the whole story, the whole narrative, namely in the shape of renovations of temples, in particular in the shape of his explicit and that demonstratively emphasized policy of a return to the old religious customs, which had been lost to the detriment of the of the populus Romanus and its moral standards. And he even put that on stage with the at least implicit message that this was one of the reasons for the civil wars. For the civil wars, that the loss of moral stamina, and that needed to be put into sort of needed to be made valid and demonstratively valid once again. It's even in the semantics of the res gestae, as well as of his Augustan propagandists, including the poets like Horace and even Ovid, although Ovid had an agenda of his own.
Very brief reflection. What's stunning, in my view, is the emphasis. How strong was the emphasis led by Augustus on restitutio, renovatio, on connecting himself and his time to the past and renovating, but reproposing and so on. As I said, this happened before, but probably the emphasis put by Augustus on all that is the most heavy one of the cases in which it's very heavy in history, and this is stunning in a way.
I couldn't agree more. That was the basic message of my presentation, that Augustus, that the only, put it that way, the only real new quality of his self-construction consisted in what you have termed particular emphasis on this. I mean, the restitutio re publica kind of ideology is the very core of his, not only of his propaganda, actually of his self-construction as princeps, as well as the central strategy of the legitimation of a new regime that he wanted to perpetuate, although he wasn't really very successful, because all his what in Britain is called the heir apparent and the heir presumptive to the throne, they all of them died, and he was left with a chap whom he liked least, whom he actually utterly disliked, as opposed to his wife, who actually was quite content with her elder son succeeding Augustus.
There is a question by Roman Frollo online, and then I think another one over there.
Hi, Roman.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
First of all, thank you so much again for it's a pleasure always to think about smaller details after you talk about the whole framework. And I was wondering about one such detail, and the question is concerning the coin leges et iura restituit. There is an idea that this coin was not really propagated widely, because you have, on the one hand, the necessity to bring forward this success in giving back the powers, but on the other hand, it is you from whom these leges et iura were taken back and then given back to the people in the Senate. And there is an idea, I think at least I've seen it in some articles by Frederick Wevat and other scholars, that Octavian wasn't really interested in propagating very widely this coin. Maybe in a similar way as he was not very interested in doing the same thing with this statue where he's not wearing anything. So what do you think? How do you think this type of situations? This is maybe just one of them, when you are both the cause and you're both the problem and the and the salvation of that problem. How do you think this type of situations may have influenced the politics of Octavian in memory sphere, so to speak? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I mean, you have already sort of implicitly made the decisive point. I mean, everything that he did from April, May 44 onwards, when he actually decided against the advice of his stepfather and his family to accept this very problematic inheritance, was a process of trial and error. And much of that, of this process actually showed that he was well aware of this dilemma already before the final victory at Actium and the conquest of Egypt, and that he was trying to find, I mean, the development, for example, of his own representation on statues, the Actium type or the earlier types, for example. I mean, this column of some time after 36 with Augustus in sort of Greek Hellenistic heroic nudity. All this kind of thing was sort of went down in his development on the side of error after having been tried, which actually shows that he must have been aware of this dilemma, that he was the problem as well as the one who had to find a kind of solution. And I try to concentrate on the semantic battles that sort of reflected, that actually reflected this underlying dilemma. Whether or not he was successful is another question. I, for one, think he was, but it took him more than 2 decades to figure it out. I mean, the acts of January 27 on the one hand and 23 on the other, and the firm development of Imperium, Consulare, Proconsule, whatever, everything shows he wanted to retain power, and he wanted at the same time to invisibilize, I hate that word, his strategies of retaining it. And that is why he actually used specific powers which on the surface looked Republican, seemed to be Republican. Even the Imperium Proconsulare, and even if we call them Imperium Proconsulare Maius, did have a Republican president, namely Pompey. Even that, Kuhanune, etc., etc. Everything that didn't have some kind of Republican model was rejected, and demonstratively so. And all that shows that he was well aware of what you have sort of aptly described as a kind of insoluble problem.
Thank you.
I hope that wasn't you got more than you bargained for, didn't you?
Thank you so much.
C'era una domanda laggiù, ho visto bene? Marco Ferrario, our PhD students.
Also zuerst vielen Dank auch meinerseits für den sehr spannenden Vortrag. More than a question is some sort of, I hope, not too random follow-up thought on what Professor Giangiulio mentioned. I mean, of course, you described a very culture-specific episode of self-representation and power handling, which, however, resonated with me very much with similar circumstances in a cross-cultural perspective, where in a really extraordinary situation, somebody with apparently almost no previous background that we know of tried to, let's say, somehow reinvent a past for himself by anchoring himself and his family in older traditions. I mean, I have 3 examples in mind: Sennacherib in the Assyrian Empire after his father's death, Cyrus the Great in the Cylinder, Darius after Cyrus, and there will be other cases from even farther contexts. I'm wondering if we are dealing here somehow, also in the case of Augustus, with what one could describe as a sort of conundrum of kingship on a, let's say, universal perspective, meaning a sort of challenge on the one hand to obtain and to showcase absolute authority, and the constraints that this position brings to the front, given that this person that's trying to assert himself as absolute ruler, emperor, is, however, part of a history, of a legacy, and of a cultural context. I mean, some years ago, David Graeber wrote that anthropological inquiries on kingship, comparative anthropological inquiry of kingship, may help understand politics, he says, everywhere. And I'm following up of what Professor Giangiulio was saying. I mean, of course, much work has been done on an anthropological inquiry on Roman history, but I wonder, what do you think about the usefulness or not of wide cross-cultural comparisons on this specific topic of kingship and his constraints within the embedded cultural system of this or that kingship tradition, if I was able to explain myself. Danke sehr.
I hope that I understood your central point, and when I now sort of cite an example which I have sort of developed further in that book on the Roman Republican theater of power, I used thank you, Tonio. Yes. I used cross-cultural and inter-epochal comparisons to highlight and to highlight the culture-specific character of the Roman Republican and early Augustan political culture, and I used Louis XIV and the construction of what we used to call absolutism in the very first phase of his reign, when he still could rely on people, in particular on a first minister who was not only a Machiavellian kind of politician, but also an expert in opera and in theatrical, sort of spectacular dramas, namely Cardinal Mazarin. And I used one specific event at the end of the Mazarin time, who died in 1662, as far as I remember, namely Louis XIV and his entrée, his ritual entrée into Paris with his new queen in 1660, which was actually staged like a Roman triumph. But the interesting thing is that this kind of cross-cultural and cross-epochal, as it were, comparison brings out a very, very specific aspect of ancient cultures, namely the dependence, the big dependence, even of monarchical or autocratic rulers on the presence of an audience. The audience doesn't play any role in this French kind of staging of autocratic power. However, even the Roman emperors after Augustus, even when they really became autocrats, more than Augustus. I've described Augustus as the last Republican. Later on, things took a turn for the worse, if I may put it that way. Even then, when the emperor appeared in public, it was necessary to take into account the reaction of the plebs, of the legions, of the praetorians, of the senators, etc. And all that was conspicuously absent when Mazarin planned this entrée into Paris. The constitutive groups like the Parliament of Paris, the Sorbonne, and the citizenry of Paris, etc., were completely left out of the planning. It was no communication, no implicit sort of communicative interaction any longer, which was constitutive of Roman and, as it were, Greek political cultures, even monarchical political regimes like the Roman Empire. All the more so in republican systems such as, for example, Athenian democracy, which is, by the way, another sort of comparative dimension which I mentioned in the book, namely the role of processions like the Panathenaic.
So, danke schön. Vielen Dank. Das Buch habe ich gekauft und muss man jetzt nur lesen. Vielen Dank.
Da haben Sie es erfasst. Yes.
So maybe we've got time for one last question or comment by Yetke, if you want to.
There was
a
Another PhD student in Roman history.
Good evening, and thank you very much for your paper. I have a very specific question about the myth of the death of Romulus you mentioned in the first part of your paper. As I am dealing with a passage of the Life of Pompey by Plutarch, in which there's a senator who actually one of the consuls on that year, 67 BC, who threatens Pompey to make him have the same end of Romulus. And so I was wondering, I got that you suggested that this myth, this version of the myth of the death of Romulus was born after the murder of Caesar, or I got it wrong, because in this case I have to suggest that Plutarch is in some way retrojecting a posterior myth into 67 BC.
I mean, the question is very interesting. Actually, what you mentioned is, I know this passage in Plutarch's Life of Pompey. It's actually one of the very few instances where this kind of variant of a myth is actually mentioned. There are only 2 or 3 parallel, and they are parallel mentionings of this myth. and this makes it pretty clear that it must have originated in the second half of the 1st century BCE. In fact, everything that refers to Romulus in inverted commas Republican literature does not have any hint in that direction. So it is obviously it obviously originated pretty late. And well, Plutarch is one source, and I'm not sure. I think Cassius Dio is even later, but I think it may also be somewhere in Appian, but I'm not quite sure. As it were, I mean, it's likely that Plutarch's allusion to this myth is actually the earliest source we have got.
Any other questions in the room? So maybe
I'm very much looking forward to our discussion tomorrow, and what we had discussed here in the last half an hour says that to compare is very important, and for me it would be very interesting to concentrate on what you said on comparison with Athenian democracy or Greek forms of representation and self-representation and sort of special performances of the elites in Greek, in classical, perhaps even in archaic Greece, when they sort of developed special forms of self-representation. That would be very nice too.
Yeah, maybe tomorrow we will have the chance to discuss further in this track. So it's 6 p.m. I think we can stop here. Thank you once again, Professor Karl-Joachim Hölkeskamp.
It's for me to thank you, and that you have given me the chance of talking about my new book, because that is what I promised my publisher.